They told me my trees had to go. Trees that I'd planted 15 years ago when my kids were just starting to walk. Trees that had grown with my family, provided shade for countless backyard barbecues, and become home to generations of birds. All because some HOA board members decided they were blocking the neighborhood view. But what happened next? Well, that's a story about standing up for what's right, even when it feels like everything's stacked against you. Before we dive into this wild journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next in this series about standing up to unreasonable HOA demands. It was a perfect Sunday morning in Maple Ridge Estates, the kind of morning where everything feels right with the world. I remember it clearly. April 15th, just as spring was painting our neighborhood in vibrant greens and soft pink cherry blossoms. I'm Thomas Anderson, but everyone calls me Tom. That morning I was doing what I'd done every Sunday for the past 15 years, enjoying my morning coffee on the back deck, surrounded by the mature maple and oak trees I'd planted when we first moved in. The trees had grown from saplings into these magnificent 30-foot guardians that provided the perfect backdrop to our family home. My wife had always said these trees were the reason we bought this house. The lot was bare back then, but she could envision what it would become. Tom, she'd said, imagine our kids climbing these trees someday. Now those same trees had witnessed countless birthday parties, graduation celebrations, and quiet family moments. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of spring. Flowers from our neighbor Jim Martinez's garden. Birds were chirping in the branches above. I'd gotten pretty good at identifying them over the years. A northern cardinal, our regular visitor, was showing off his bright red feathers, while his mate built their nest in one of the maples. I took another sip of my coffee, thinking about how perfect everything was. Our youngest, Emma, had just been accepted to college, and we were planning a graduation party in the backyard. The trees would be strung with lights, just like they had been for every other celebration we'd hosted. That's when I heard the distinct sound of high heels on concrete, followed by an authoritative knock at our front door. Strange for a Sunday morning, I thought, but didn't think much of it as I made my way through the house. Opening the door, I found myself face to face with Patricia Weber, our newly elected HOA board president, flanked by Bob Campbell, another board member. Patricia's perfectly coiffed hair and pressed pantsuit seemed out of place for a weekend morning, but that was just her style. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," Patricia said, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that immediately sets off warning bells. "We need to discuss your trees." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. In our 15 years here, no one had ever complained about our trees. They were properly maintained, healthy, and if anything, added value to the neighborhood. "Your trees," Patricia continued, pulling out an official-looking document from her leather portfolio, "have been deemed in violation of the HOA's new view preservation guidelines. They're blocking the neighborhood's mountain vista, and several residents have complained." I stood there, coffee mug still in hand, trying to process what I was hearing. The mountains were barely visible from most houses anyway, and our trees had been here longer than many of the residents. "We'll need them removed within 30 days, she said, handing me the document. "All 5 of the mature trees in your backyard. The HOA board voted on this last week." "Removed?" I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "These trees have been here for 15 years. They're part of our home." Patricia's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "The guidelines are clear, Mr. Anderson. View preservation is a priority for maintaining property values in Maple Ridge Estates. You can review the documentation, but the decision is final." As they turned to leave, Patricia paused and looked back. "Oh, and do make sure to use an HOA-approved tree removal service. We wouldn't want any additional violations." I watched. then walk away, their figures growing smaller as they headed down our curved driveway. The document in my hand felt heavy, like it was made of lead instead of paper. Behind me, I could hear the cardinal still singing in the maple tree, completely unaware that his home had just been marked for destruction. Looking down at the paper, I noticed my hands were shaking. This wasn't just about some trees or a view. This was about our home, our memories, our family's sanctuary. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I barely noticed. Walking back to the deck, I looked up at our trees, really looked at them. Walking back to the deck, I looked up at our trees, really looked at them. The morning sun was filtering through the leaves, creating dancing shadows on the wooden deck. Emma's old swing, now rarely used but never removed, swayed gently in the breeze. These trees were more than just landscaping. They were the silent witnesses to our family's story. That's when I knew. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of following HOA orders. These trees weren't coming down without a fight. I spent the rest of that Sunday in a daze, alternating between staring at the HOA notice and gazing at my trees through the kitchen window. The document was filled with bureaucratic language about view corridors and community aesthetic standards, but all I could think about was the cardinal's nest that would be destroyed, the shade that kept Emma's reading nook cool in summer, and the branches that had held our children's dreams. My wife Janet came home from her hospital shift that evening to find me surrounded by old photo albums spread across our dining room table. Pictures of birthday parties under the maple trees, our son Michael's graduation photos with the oak trees. In the background, Emma's first attempt at climbing with me, spotting her from below. 15 years of memories, all documented in fading photographs. "They can't just do this," Janet said, her voice tight with emotion after I showed her the notice. She'd kicked off her nursing shoes and was holding the HOA document like it might bite. There has to be some kind of appeal process. I pulled out my laptop and started diving into research. The HOA guidelines were a maze of contradictions and recent amendments. The view preservation rule Patricia had cited was buried in a document dated just 3 months ago, passed during a special session of the board. Most homeowners probably didn't even know it existed. As I dug deeper, my shock began to transform into something else, determination mixed with anger. The more I read, the more questions I had. How could a few board members decide to fundamentally alter the character of our neighborhood? Who had complained about the views, and why Target? Our trees specifically? I couldn't sleep that night. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself standing in our backyard with a flashlight, looking up at the silhouettes of our trees against the starlit sky. The beam caught something white fluttering in the branches, a piece of Emma's kite that had gotten stuck up there last summer. We'd laughed about it for weeks, calling it our permanent decoration. Monday morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. This was too important to handle with just evening hours. I needed to understand exactly what we were up against. I started by taking photographs, hundreds of them. Close-ups of each tree, wide shots showing their position in relation to the supposed view corridor, detailed images of the healthy root systems and soil. I measured their circumference, documented their species, and noted the wildlife that called them home. My neighbor Jim Martinez spotted me during my documentation frenzy and came over to check what was happening. When I explained the situation, his usually cheerful face darkened. "You're kidding me," he said, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "They can't just order you to remove healthy, mature trees." Jim disappeared for a few minutes and came back with his own HOA notice. His was about his garden. Apparently, his award-winning roses were too tall and obstructed sight lines. The notice was dated just a week before mine, signed with the same perfect penmanship from Patricia Weber. "Something's not right here, Tom," Jim said, comparing our notices. "These new guidelines, they're changing the whole character of Maple Ridge Estates." And for what? A view that's mostly blocked by clouds 9 months out of the years. No, I spent the afternoon creating a detailed timeline of our tree's history. Planting dates, growth measurements over the years, maintenance records, even certificates from the local gardening society that had featured our yard in their annual tour 3 years ago. My hands were shaking as I worked, but not from fear anymore, from purpose. Around 4 o'clock, a sleek black SUV drove slowly past our house. Through the window, I caught Patricia Weber's face, her expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses. She seemed to be taking notes on a small pad as she crept past our property. The display of surveillance made my skin crawl, but it also strengthened my resolve. That evening, I received an email from the HOA with an attached list of approved tree removal services. The prices they quoted were astronomical, nearly triple the normal rate. At the bottom was a note: failure to use approved services will result in additional fines and penalties. I forwarded the email to my personal account and started a new folder labeled HOA documentation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Something told me this was just the beginning, and every piece of evidence might matter. Janet came home to find me still at the computer, surrounded by papers and photos. She placed a hand on my shoulder, and I could feel her hospital day exhaustion. "What are we going to do?" she asked softly. I reached up and squeezed her hand. "We're going to fight," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "But we're going to do it smart. These trees aren't just about us anymore. If they can do this to our property, they can do it to anyone's." Later that night, I stood at our bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit silhouettes of our trees. The cardinal's nest was barely visible in the darkness, but I knew it was there. Tomorrow, I would start making calls to lawyers, arborists, environmental groups, anyone who might be able to help. This wasn't just about preserving a view anymore. It was about preserving the soul of our neighborhood, one tree at a time. As I finally drifted off to sleep, the gentle rustling of leaves outside our window seemed different now. Not just peaceful, but defiant. Those trees had weathered 15 years of storms, and they weren't going down without a fight. Neither was I. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pristine glass windows of the Maple Ridge Estates Community Center as I walked through its doors. The weekly HOA board meeting was scheduled to start in 15 minutes, and I had deliberately arrived early. The polished wooden floors echoed with each step as I made my way to the conference room, my folder of documentation feeling heavier than its actual weight. Patricia Weber was already there, arranging papers at the head of the long mahogany table. She looked up as I entered, her perfectly manicured fingers pausing mid-shuffle. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her tone carrying that same artificial sweetness from Sunday. "The open forum portion of our meeting isn't until the end. You'll need to wait outside." "Actually," I replied, setting my folder down at the table, "I checked our bylaws carefully. As a homeowner, I have the right to observe the entire meeting." I pulled out a chair and sat down, maintaining eye contact. "I'm particularly interested in the discussion about these new view preservation guidelines." A flicker of annoyance crossed Patricia's face before she could mask it. Bob Campbell chose that moment to walk in, followed by Karen Sullivan, the HOA secretary. Karen offered me a small, apologetic smile as she took her seat, while Bob pointedly looked away. Other board members filtered in, and I noticed how they unconsciously oriented themselves around Patricia, like planets orbiting a sun. Last to arrive was George Phillips, the elderly board member who'd lived in Maple Ridge Estates since its founding. He raised an eyebrow at my presence but said nothing as he eased into his chair. Patricia called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. First item on the agenda, approval of the landscape modification requirements under Section 7, 3 of the Community Guidelines. She spoke rapidly, shuffling through papers. All in favor? Point of order, I interrupted, my voice stronger than I felt. According to the bylaws, any major modifications to community guidelines require a general notice to all homeowners at least 30 days prior to the vote. Was this done? The room fell silent. Karen Sullivan's pen stopped its scratching against her notepad. Patricia's smile tightened at the corners. Mr. Anderson, while we appreciate your enthusiasm for procedure, this matter has already been voted on and approved. In a special session, I continued, opening my folder, with no general notice, no community input, and coincidentally, during the week, when half the board members were out of town for the holidays. I have the attendance records here. I slid a copy across the table. George Phillips leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the document. He's right, Patricia. This vote wasn't properly noticed. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. The board has the authority to make emergency modifications when necessary. The declining property values due to obstructed views constituted an emergency. I pulled out another document. Interesting you should mention property values. I have the last 5 years of sales data for Maple Ridge Estates. Houses with mature trees consistently sold for 15% more than those without. I'd be happy to share copies with everyone. Mr. Anderson, Patricia snapped, her artificial sweetness evaporating. Your trees are in violation of current guidelines. The time for debate is over. You have 26 days remaining to comply. And you have 24 hours to prove. These guidelines were legally enacted, I countered, before my letter requesting a formal review by the State Housing Board is submitted. I patted another envelope in my folder. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Karen Sullivan was writing furiously now, her pen practically burning through the paper. Are you threatening this board? Patricia's voice was low, dangerous. Not at all, I replied calmly. I'm simply exercising my rights as a homeowner, rights that include due process, proper notification of guidelines changes, and protection against arbitrary enforcement. I turned to address the entire board. Did you know that Patricia has issued similar violations to 6 other homeowners in the past month, all targeting landscaping features that have been in place for years? George Phillips frowned. 6 others? I only remember voting on 2 violations this month. Because the others were issued without a board vote, I explained, sliding another document across the table, which is explicitly forbidden by our bylaws. Patricia's hand slammed down on the table. This meeting is not a forum for personal attacks. Mr. Anderson, if you continue to disrupt proceedings, you will be asked to leave. By all means, I said, standing slowly. But before I go, I'd like to make sure everyone has copies of these documents, including the letter I received suggesting I use approved tree removal services at 3 times the market rate. I began distributing papers around the table. I'm sure the State Housing Board will find it interesting that these approved services all share the same business address, an address registered to P. Weber Consulting, LLC. The color drained from Patricia's face. Bob Campbell suddenly became very interested in his water glass. Karen Sullivan's pen had stopped moving entirely. This is outrageous, Patricia sputtered. These accusations are completely unfounded. Then you won't mind if we review them in detail? George Phillips asked, his voice carrying the weight of his years in the community. Perhaps in a properly noticed meeting, with all homeowners present? Patricia's eyes darted around the table, finding no allies. Even Bob Campbell wouldn't meet her gaze. Fine, she said through clenched teeth. We'll schedule a community meeting. But this doesn't change anything, Mr. Anderson. Your trees are still in violation. We'll let the community decide that, I replied, gathering my remaining documents. After all, isn't that how a homeowners association is supposed to work? As I walked out of the conference room, I could hear the murmur of concerned voices behind me. George Phillips was asking pointed questions about the other violation notices. Karen Sullivan was proposing an immediate audit of recent board decisions. In the parking lot, I took a deep breath of the morning air. A pair of cardinals flew overhead, heading in the direction of my maple trees. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time since Sunday, I felt like we had a fighting chance. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. How did it go? I looked back at the community center where the board meeting had clearly devolved into chaos. Better than expected, I replied, but we're going to need help, a lot of it. The Cardinals' song echoed across the parking lot, a reminder of exactly what we were fighting for. It wasn't just about trees anymore, it was about standing up to corruption, about protecting our community from those who would abuse their power for personal gain. And somehow, I knew this was just the beginning. The business card in my hand read, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, PhD, Environmental Impact Assessment. And Arboreal Sciences. It had taken dozens of calls to find someone with her credentials, and as she walked around my yard, methodically examining each tree, I knew the effort had been worth it. Her movements were precise, her observations detailed, and her expression grew increasingly concerned as she took measurements and soil samples. These maples are remarkable specimens, she said, crouching to examine the root structure of the largest tree. The soil composition is perfect, the growth patterns are healthy, and they're providing essential ecosystem services to your entire neighborhood. She stood up, brushing dirt from her khakis. Removing them would do far more than just aesthetic damage. I followed her as she moved from tree to tree, watching her take photographs and make notes on her tablet. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled shadows that danced across her professional navy blazer. She paused at the oak tree where the cardinal pair had made their nest. You see this? She pointed to a particular branch. Configuration. This is a textbook example of optimal bird habitat. These trees aren't just random landscaping. They're a crucial part of the local ecosystem. I'm counting at least 3 active nests, and based on the marking patterns, this is probably a regular stop for migratory species too. Dr. Mitchell pulled up a satellite view of our neighborhood on her tablet. Look at this from above, she said, zooming out to show the surrounding areas. Your property is part of a green corridor that connects 2 larger wooded areas. Remove these trees, and you're not just affecting your yard, you're breaking a wildlife highway that's been establishing itself for over a decade. She spent the next hour conducting core samples, measuring canopy coverage, and documenting the various species of birds and insects that called our trees home. Each observation was meticulously recorded, accompanied by photographs and GPS coordinates. I'll have my full report ready in a few days, she said, packing up her equipment. But I can tell you right now, removing these trees would violate several environmental protection guidelines. The fact that they're healthy, mature specimens, providing documented ecological services, makes this a complex issue that goes beyond simple HOA aesthetics. As if to emphasize her point, a group of goldfinches landed in the maple nearest to us, their bright yellow feathers catching the sunlight. Dr. Mitchell quickly photographed them, adding to her documentation. That's the 4th species I've seen. In just these few hours, she murmured. Your trees are more than just trees, Mr. Anderson. They're a habitat, an ecosystem, and a vital part of this community's environmental health. After Dr. Mitchell left, I made another call, this one to Maria Patel, a landscape architect recommended by Jim Martinez. She arrived that afternoon, her creative energy evident in her quick movements and rapid-fire observations. Where Dr. Mitchell had focused on environmental impact, Maria saw design and community value. These trees create natural privacy screens, reduce noise pollution from the main road, and add significant property value through aesthetic appeal, she explained, sketching quickly in her notebook. The placement is actually perfect. They frame views rather than obstruct them. From a design perspective, removing them would devastate the visual harmony of the entire street. Maria walked the property line, taking measurements and photographs from different angles. She paid particular attention to the supposed view corridor that Patricia had mentioned in her violation notice. "This is absurd," she said, looking toward the mountains. "The trees actually create forced perspective that enhances the mountain view. Remove them, and you'll just have an empty sight line to the highway first, mountains second." She pulled out a drone, sending it up to capture aerial footage of the neighborhood. The images it sent back were revealing. Our trees were part of a larger pattern of greenery that gave Maple Ridge Estates its distinctive character. "Look," she said, showing me the screen. "Your trees are integral to the neighborhood's design. Aesthetic. They're not blocking the view, they're framing it, enhancing it." The drone footage also revealed something interesting. Several board members' properties, including Patricia's, had similar or larger trees that would technically violate the same guidelines being used against us. Maria marked their locations on her map, adding another layer to our growing documentation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows from our threatened trees, Maria finished her assessment. "I'll prepare a comprehensive report on the aesthetic and property value implications," she said, packing up her equipment, "including comparative analysis of similar properties in the area. If they try to argue this is about property values, we'll have hard data to prove otherwise." That evening, Janet and I sat on our deck, surrounded by the gentle rustle of leaves and the evening songs of birds settling in for the night. I spread out the preliminary notes from both experts on our patio table, their professional observations adding weight to what we'd known in our hearts all along. These trees were more than just landscaping. "Look at this," Janet said, pointing to a section of Dr. Mitchell's notes. "The root system is actually helping prevent soil erosion on the whole street. Remove these trees, and it could affect the foundation stability of houses down the hill." She shook her head, her nurse's instinct for caring extending to our leafy neighbors. As we sat there, a familiar black SUV crept past our house. Patricia Weber was making another one of her observation drives, but this time I felt ready. Let her look. Let her take notes. We were building a case that went far beyond HOA guidelines and property values. This was about environmental responsibility, community design, and the right to maintain healthy, beneficial landscaping. The cardinal pair returned to their nest as darkness fell, their silhouettes visible against the twilight sky. Tomorrow, we would receive the full reports from both experts, adding professional weight to our defense. But tonight, watching the birds settle in for the night, I realized we'd gained something else too, a deeper understanding of just how much these trees meant, not just to us, but to the entire neighborhood ecosystem. I pulled out my phone and added Dr. Mitchell's and Maria's preliminary findings to my growing digital folder of evidence. Piece by piece, we were building a case that would be hard to ignore. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, their leaves seeming to whisper encouragement. They had stood their ground for 15 years, providing shelter, beauty, and life to our community. With the help of these experts, we would make sure they stood for many more years to come. Frank Thompson's law office smelled of leather and old books, a stark contrast to the sterile community center where I'd confronted the HOA board. The veteran real estate attorney leaned back in his chair, reviewing the stack of documents I'd brought. expert reports, violation notices, board meeting minutes, and property records. "They really stepped in it this time," Frank said, removing his reading glasses and placing them deliberately on his mahogany desk. These new guidelines weren't just improperly enacted, they're potentially illegal under state environmental protection laws. He tapped Dr. Mitchell's report with his index finger, especially given the documented wildlife habitat your trees provide. Outside his office window, downtown Cedar County bustled with midday activity. Frank stood up and walked to a wall of legal books, pulling out a thick volume. "Here's something Patricia Weber probably didn't consider," he said, flipping through pages. "Our state has specific protections for established urban canopy. Trees over 10 years old that provide documented environmental benefits can't be removed without an environmental impact study and public comment period." He returned to his desk and began drafting a letter on his computer. "We're going to hit them from multiple angles," he explained, fingers flying over the keyboard. "First, the procedural violations in enacting the guidelines. Second, the environmental protection issues. Third, the selective enforcement. Those drone photos of board members' properties are gold. And fourth," he smiled grimly, "the potential conflict of interest with those approved tree removal services." The letter took shape as Frank worked, each paragraph a carefully constructed legal argument. I watched as he wove together the evidence we'd gathered, transforming our scattered documentation into a cohesive legal challenge. When he finished, he printed 3 copies and handed them to me. "This goes to the HOA board, the State Housing Authority, and the Environmental Protection Office," he said. "They have 72 hours to respond before we file for an emergency injunction." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But be prepared. This is just the opening move. Patricia Weber doesn't strike me as someone who backs down easily." I left Frank's office feeling both empowered and anxious. The weight of the legal documents in my briefcase reminded me that this had escalated beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. As I drove home, I noticed more details about our community, the way trees lined most streets, how they created natural boundaries between properties, how they made Maple Ridge Estates feel like a real neighborhood rather than just a collection of houses. Pulling into my driveway, I saw Karen Sullivan, the HOA secretary, speed walking past my house. She slowed when she saw me, glancing furtively over her shoulder before approaching. "Tom," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something, but not here." She gestured toward the coffee shop at the entrance of our subdivision. 20 minutes later, we sat in a corner booth, Karen nervously shredding a paper napkin. "Patricia's been planning this for months," she confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "The view preservation guidelines were just the beginning. She's working with a developer. They want to modernize the neighborhood." Karen pulled out her phone, showing me an email she'd received. "They're planning to clear-cut most of the mature trees and standardize all landscaping. Your property is just the test case." My coffee grew cold as Karen revealed more details. The developer, Highland Vista Properties, had options to purchase several lots in the neighborhood. Their plan involved creating what they called a contemporary aesthetic, which apparently meant removing most of the existing trees and natural landscaping. Patricia gets a consulting fee for every property that signs up for the modernization. A program, Karen added, her hands trembling slightly. "That's why she pushed through those guidelines without proper notice. They need to start the clearing process before people realize what's really happening." I took photos of the emails Karen showed me, adding them to our growing collection of evidence. As we left the coffee shop, she grabbed my arm. "I never told you any of this," she said, her eyes wide with worry. "Patricia would make my life hell if she knew." Back home, I immediately called Frank Thompson and forwarded him the new information. His response was immediate. This changes everything. We're not just fighting a bad HOA decision, we're fighting a commercial development scheme disguised as community guidelines. I spent the rest of the afternoon making copies of everything. We gathered the expert reports, legal documents, Karen's emails, and all our photographic evidence went into carefully organized folders. If Patricia wanted to play hardball, we needed to be ready. That evening, a certified letter arrived from the HOA board. Inside was a formal response to our challenge. They were doubling down. Not only were they refusing to reconsider the tree removal order, but they were also shortening the compliance deadline to 15 days, citing emergency powers under the HOA bylaws. I scanned the letter and sent it to Frank. His reply was swift. "Perfect. They just gave us grounds for immediate legal action. I'm filing for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning." As darkness fell, I walked my property line, looking at each of our threatened trees. The cardinal pair had returned to their nest, settling in for the night. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from nearby gardens. Everything felt peaceful, but I knew we were on the brink of a much bigger fight. My phone buzzed with text messages from neighbors. Word of Karen's revelation was spreading. Jim Martinez was organizing an emergency community meeting. The young couple next door, Daniel and Emily Wilson, offered to help distribute information packets. Even George Phillips, the elderly board member, called to express his support. Standing under the canopy of our largest maple tree, I realized this wasn't just about saving our trees anymore. We were fighting to preserve the very character of our community, to prevent it from being stripped bare by corporate greed disguised as progress. The trees swayed gently overhead, their branches reaching toward the stars, silent witnesses to the battle brewing below. Tomorrow, we would file our legal challenge. Tomorrow, we would start rallying the community in earnest. Tomorrow, we would show Patricia Weber and her developer friends that they had picked the wrong neighborhood to strip mine for profit. But tonight, listening to the evening chorus of birds settling into their leafy homes, I felt a profound sense of purpose. These trees had protected and sheltered us for 15 years. Now it was our turn to protect them. Emily Brooks's sunroom felt like a greenhouse, filled with potted plants and the gentle burble of a small fountain. The retired botanist poured tea into delicate china cups as neighbors filtered in, filling every available chair and spilling into standing room. The emergency community meeting had spread by word of mouth, carefully avoiding any official channels that might alert Patricia Weber to our gathering. "I've lived in Maple Ridge Estates for 30 years, Emily began, her soft voice carrying authority earned from decades of academic research. "These trees aren't just decorative, they're the lungs of our neighborhood." She gestured to a series of photographs spread across her coffee table, showing the community's evolution from bare lots to a verdant sanctuary. Jim Martinez stood up, holding printouts of the Highland Vista Properties development plans that Karen had leaked. "Look at what they're proposing," he said, passing the papers around. "Concrete retaining walls, artificial turf, and something called sculptured foliage installations, basically plastic trees." The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Daniel Wilson, the young software engineer from next door, projected his laptop screen onto Emily's wall. "I've been analyzing the financial documents," he said, scrolling through spreadsheets. "The modernization program would cost each homeowner an average of $50,000, with ongoing maintenance fees paid to, guess who, P. Weber Consulting." Maria Patel, who had joined us fresh from another property assessment, stood up with her own findings. "They're not just targeting the Andersons' trees," she explained, displaying her drone footage. "I've identified 43 properties that would be affected by these new guidelines. That's nearly half the neighborhood." The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. Susan Chen, whose Japanese maple collection had won regional awards, wiped tears from her eyes. "My trees are over 20 years old," she whispered. "They're irreplaceable." Robert Foster, a retired civil engineer, raised his hand. "I've reviewed the drainage implications," he said, unfolding a topographical map. "Removing mature trees on this scale would drastically affect soil stability. The development plans don't adequately address erosion control." As each neighbor shared their expertise and concerns, a pattern emerged. Patricia Weber hadn't just miscalculated by targeting our trees. She had inadvertently awakened a community of professionals, experts, and passionate homeowners who understood exactly what was at stake. Linda Ramirez, a local journalist, took detailed notes. "This isn't just a neighborhood story," she said. "It's about corporate developers using HOA bylaws to force through unauthorized changes. People need to know about this." The meeting shifted from sharing information to planning action. George Phillips, armed with his decades of HOA board experience, outlined the process for removing board members. "We need a 75% vote," he explained, "but first we have to document violations of fiduciary duty." Emily Brooks offered her sunroom as a permanent meeting space for what we dubbed the Tree Protection Committee. Her expertise in botany would prove invaluable in documenting the environmental impact of the proposed changes. Rachel Chen, AEQA, local environmental advocate, brought up another crucial point. The state's Urban Forestry Protection Act requires public hearings before any major canopy reduction, she explained. These guidelines completely bypass that requirement. As the meeting progressed, neighbors volunteered their skills and resources. The Wilsons would create a secure website for sharing documents and coordinating efforts. Jim Martinez, with his landscaping contacts, would organize professional assessments of affected properties. Linda Ramirez would prepare media coverage, holding it ready if needed. Sarah Mitchell, who had joined us via video call, shared additional findings from her environmental impact study. The wildlife corridor these trees create is protected under federal guidelines, she explained. Removing them would violate multiple environmental regulations. Michael Green, a quiet man whose property bordered mine, finally spoke up. "Patricia approached me last month," he revealed, "offered to fast-track approval for a pool installation if I supported the new guidelines. I have it in writing." He pulled out an email, adding to our growing evidence of misconduct. As darkness fell outside, Emily's sunroom had transformed into a command center. Maps covered the walls, marked with affected properties and critical environmental zones. Laptops displayed property records, legal documents, and environmental studies. The air hummed with purpose and determination. Frank Thompson called in with an update on our legal strategy. "The emergency injunction hearing is set for next week," he announced over speakerphone, "but we need to be ready for Patricia's response. She won't go down without a fight." Janet, who had been quietly observing while taking notes, suddenly stood up. "We need to remember what we're fighting for," she said, pulling up photos on her phone. "This isn't just about trees or property values, it's about our community." She displayed images of neighborhood gatherings, children playing under shade trees, families celebrating milestones in their backyards. "This is what Patricia and her developers want to destroy." The room fell silent as we looked at the photos. Each image captured what made our neighborhood special: the natural beauty, the sense of community, the harmony between human homes and natural spaces. As the meeting wound down, we had a clear action plan. Teams were formed, responsibilities assigned, and communication channels established. We would fight this battle on multiple fronts: legal, environmental, and community organizing. Emily walked us to her door, her small frame straight with purpose. "You know," she said, looking out at her own carefully tended garden, "in all my years of studying plants, I've learned one thing. The strongest trees are those that grow together, supporting each other through their root systems. Perhaps we needed this threat to remind us of that truth." Walking home under the canopy of trees that lined our streets, I felt a renewed sense of hope. Patricia Weber had tried to divide our community with her arbitrary guidelines and secret deals. Instead, she had united us, awakening a powerful force she never saw coming. Neighbors who understood the true value of what we stood to lose. The cardinal pair swooped overhead, returning to their nest in our threatened maple tree. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight we were no longer fighting alone. Our roots, like those of our beloved trees, had grown stronger through connection, creating a foundation that no developer's scheme could easily uproot. The city council chambers buzzed with tension as the Environmental Review Board settled into their seats. Frank Thompson adjusted his tie and gave me a reassuring nod as we waited for the hearing to begin. The room had filled quickly. Our neighbors occupied most of the public seating area, while Patricia Weber and her development team huddled near the front, surrounded by expensive-looking lawyers. Commissioner Eleanor Martinez, no relation to our neighbor Jim, called the meeting to order. Her stern expression suggested she understood the gravity of the situation. "This emergency hearing will address the proposed landscape modifications at Maple Ridge Estates," she announced, her voice echoing through the chamber. "We'll begin with the petitioner's presentation." Frank stood, his weathered leather briefcase creaking as he opened it. "Thank you, Commissioner," he began, distributing comprehensive information packets to the board members. "We're here today because of an urgent threat to protected environmental resources in our community." The presentation that followed was masterful. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's environmental impact study appeared on the large screen behind the commissioners, showing detailed analysis of the wildlife corridor our trees helped maintain. Maria Patel's architectural renderings demonstrated how the proposed modernization would fundamentally alter the neighborhood's character. "These aren't just aesthetic changes," Frank explained, highlighting key points in the development plans. "This is a systematic attempt to circumvent environmental protection laws under the guise of HOA guidelines." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Frank revealed the connection between P. Weber Consulting and Highland Vista Properties. The commissioners leaned forward, their interest clearly piqued by the financial documents Daniel Wilson had uncovered. "Furthermore," Frank continued, "we have evidence that these guidelines were enacted without proper notice or community input." He played a recording from our HOA meeting, captured by Karen Sullivan's phone, where Patricia dismissed concerns about proper procedure. The Highland Vista legal team requested a brief recess, their faces betraying concern as they huddled with Patricia in the hallway. Through the chamber's windows, I could see our maple trees in the distance, their leaves catching the afternoon sunlight. When the hearing resumed, Patricia's lead attorney attempted to redirect the focus. "These changes are necessary for property value maintenance," he argued, presenting graphs showing theoretical market projections. "The HOA has both the right and responsibility to protect community interests." Commissioner Martinez removed her glasses, fixing the attorney with a stern look. "Are you aware that removing established urban canopy requires extensive environmental impact studies? Studies that, according to our records, were never conducted?" The attorney faltered, shuffling through his papers. Patricia whispered urgently in his ear, but the damage was done. The commissioners exchanged knowing looks as Frank presented our final piece of evidence, a comprehensive survey showing how the proposed changes would affect protected species nesting in our community's trees. Emily Brooks testified next, her botanical expertise lending weight to our environmental concerns. She explained how the root systems of mature trees prevented soil erosion throughout the neighborhood, protecting foundations and maintaining water table stability. Removing these trees wouldn't just affect wildlife, she explained, pointing to soil composition charts. It would fundamentally destabilize the entire area's ecosystem. Robert Foster followed with his engineering analysis, demonstrating how the proposed changes would impact drainage patterns. His detailed topographical maps showed potential flooding risks that Highland Vista's plans had conspicuously ignored. The mood in the chamber shifted as evidence mounted. Even Patricia's expensive legal team seemed to realize they were fighting a losing battle. The commissioners asked increasingly pointed questions about the development plans, the rushed guidelines, and the connection to P. Weber Consulting. During a brief afternoon break, Linda Ramirez, our journalist neighbor, pulled me aside. "Channel 7 is interested in the story," she whispered. "They're particularly intrigued by the connection between the HOA and the developers. This could go national." Frank overheard and nodded approvingly. "Public pressure might be useful," he mused, "especially if the commissioners don't rule in our favor." But as the hearing continued, it became clear that the Environmental Review Board was taking our concerns seriously. They paid particular attention to Dr. Mitchell's analysis of the wildlife corridor and the potential impact on migratory bird patterns. Patricia's team attempted to argue that the guidelines fell under HOA jurisdiction beyond the board's purview. Commissioner Martinez shut that down quickly. "Environmental protection laws supersede HOA guidelines," she stated firmly. "This board has both the right and obligation to intervene when protected resources are threatened." The sun was setting by the time closing arguments began. Frank synthesized our case masterfully, weaving together environmental concerns, procedural violations, and evidence of conflict of interest into a compelling narrative of corporate overreach and environmental threat. Patricia's attorney seemed deflated in response, falling back on technical arguments about HOA authority that rang hollow in the face of our overwhelming evidence. As the commissioners retired to deliberate, our neighbors gathered in the hallway. Jim Martinez distributed coffee from a nearby cart, while Emily Brooks shared homemade cookies she'd baked that morning. The sense of community was palpable. We weren't just fighting for trees anymore, but for the soul of our neighborhood. The deliberation was shorter than expected. Within an hour, we were called back into the chamber. Commissioner Martinez's expression was unreadable as she prepared to deliver the board's decision. "Based on the evidence presented," she began, "this board finds that the proposed landscape modifications at Maple Ridge Estates pose a significant environmental threat to protected resources." She paused, ensuring her next words carried full weight. "We are issuing an immediate injunction against any tree removal or major landscape modifications pending a full environmental impact study." The relief in the room was immediate and profound. Our neighbors exchanged quiet congratulations while Patricia's team huddled in urgent discussion. But Commissioner Martinez wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, "we are referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office for investigation into possible violations of environmental protection laws." She fixed Patricia with a stern look. "This board takes attempts to circumvent environmental regulations very seriously." As we filed out of the chambers, the evening sky had turned a deep purple. The trees lining the street seemed to stand taller somehow, their leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. We had won this battle, but something in Commissioner Martinez's final words suggested that a bigger fight was just beginning. Frank gathered us in the parking lot for a quick debrief. "This is a significant victory," he said, "but stay vigilant. Patricia and Highland Vista won't give up easily. They have too much invested in this project." Looking back at the City Hall building, I noticed Patricia in intense discussion with her lawyers, her gestures sharp with anger. The cardinal pair that had become symbols of our fight soared overhead, heading home to their nest in our maple tree. They at least would rest safely tonight. The morning headlines in the Cedar County Gazette hit like a thunderbolt. Local HOA president steps down amid investigation. None of us had expected Patricia Weber to resign, but there she was, quoted in the article about pursuing other opportunities and personal reasons for her departure. It should have felt like victory. Instead, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as I read further. Linda Ramirez called before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. "Tom, this isn't right," she said, her journalist's instincts on high alert. "I've been digging into Highland Vista Properties. They just registered 5 new shell companies in the past week. They're planning something big." My phone buzzed with another call, Karen Sullivan. "Emergency board meeting tonight," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "They're appointing Robert Maxwell as interim president. He's one of Patricia's business partners." Robert Maxwell. The name tugged at my memory. Daniel Wilson had mentioned him in his research, a developer with a history of aggressive property acquisitions. Now he would be leading our HOA board. The emergency board meeting was held in the community center's main hall instead of the usual conference room. The turnout was unprecedented. Nearly every homeowner in Maple Ridge Estates packed into the space. Maxwell cut an imposing figure. At the podium, his tailored suit and carefully styled silver hair projecting authority. "Changes are coming to our community," he announced, his voice carrying a practiced smoothness that set my teeth on edge. "The board has received multiple offers from investment groups interested in acquiring properties for redevelopment. As your new president, I intend to facilitate these opportunities." The room erupted in questions and protests. Maxwell raised his hand for silence. "Additionally, we're implementing new fines for landscape violations, $10,000 per day, effective immediately." Emily Brooks stood up, her small frame vibrating with anger. "You can't do that! The Environmental Board issued an injunction." Maxwell's smile never wavered. "The injunction prevents removal of trees. It says nothing about fines for existing violations." He gestured to a stack of papers on the podium. "You'll all be receiving updated notices tomorrow." Frank Thompson, who had insisted on attending, was already scribbling notes. "This won't hold up legally," he whispered to me, "but fighting it will drain resources. That's probably their strategy." After the meeting, our core group gathered at Emily's sunroom. The atmosphere was tense as we processed this new threat. "They're trying to force us out," Jim Martinez said, pacing between the potted plants. "Make it so expensive to stay that we have to sell." Daniel Wilson pulled up property records on his laptop. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a complex web of corporate registrations. Highland Vista's shell companies have been acquiring options on properties all around the neighborhood. They're surrounding us. Maria Patel spread out her latest architectural renderings. "Their endgame isn't just our neighborhood," she explained. "They're planning a massive commercial development. Our properties are just the first phase." The revelation hit hard. This wasn't just about trees anymore. It was about the wholesale destruction of our community. Robert Foster's engineering analysis had hinted at this, showing how the drainage patterns would support larger structures. A knock at the door startled everyone. Karen Sullivan entered, clutching a fresh stack of documents. "I'm sorry," she said, tears in her eyes. "They're making everyone on the board sign these." She handed over a thick contract. "If we don't, they'll sue us personally for breaching fiduciary duty." Frank examined the contract, his frown deepening. "This is essentially a gag order," he said. They're trying to silence anyone with inside knowledge of their plans. Linda Ramirez was already on her phone, calling her media contacts. "We need to get this story out now," she insisted, "before they can bury it in legal proceedings." A series of car doors slamming drew us to the windows. 3 black SUVs had parked along the street. Men in suits were delivering envelopes to every house in the neighborhood. The new violation notices, right on schedule. $10,000 a day, Susan Chen whispered, clutching her notice. "They know we can't afford to fight this long term." But as I looked around Emily's sunroom at the determined faces of my neighbors, I saw something Maxwell and his developers hadn't counted on. Community, resilience, the kind of strength that grows from years of shared lives and common purpose. Janet squeezed my hand as Frank outlined our options. We could challenge the fines in court. We could file complaints with state regulators. We could go to the media. But everything would take time, and Maxwell knew it. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows through the trees they were so determined to destroy. The cardinal pair swooped between branches, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. Their nest, like our homes, was under threat from forces that valued profit over preservation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell called in via video conference, her face grave as she shared her latest findings. "The environmental impact isn't just local," she explained. "This development would disrupt a crucial migratory pathway. We might be able to use federal wildlife protection laws." George Phillips, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "I've served on this board for 20 years, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "What they're doing, it isn't just unethical. It's a violation of everything this community stands for." As night fell, we formulated our response. Daniel and Sophie Wilson would create a secure communication network for residents, bypassing official HOA channels. Jim Martinez would coordinate with neighboring communities who might face similar threats. Emily Brooks would document every plant and animal species that called our trees home. Linda Ramirez's story was set to break in the morning papers. Frank Thompson had drafted emergency appeals against the fines. But Maxwell's words echoed in my mind. Changes are coming to our community. Looking around at my neighbors, friends now really, I realized that change had already come. Not the kind Maxwell and his developers planned, but something deeper. We had discovered what it truly meant to be a community. The cardinal pair settled into their nest as we left Emily's house, their silhouette visible against the rising moon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new battles to fight. But tonight, watching my neighbors walk home under the canopy of threatened trees, I knew one thing for certain: we would face it together. The Cedar County Convention Center hummed with anticipation as hundreds of residents filed into the main auditorium. The emergency town hall meeting had drawn people from across the region, not just Maple Ridge Estates. Linda Ramirez's story had struck a nerve, revealing similar development schemes threatening other neighborhoods. Television cameras lined the back wall. The local station had picked up the story, and now even national outlets were showing interest. Robert Maxwell sat on the stage with his team of lawyers, his usual composure showing cracks around the edges. The sight of so many angry residents had clearly caught him off guard. Mayor Eleanor Thompson, who had called this meeting after countless constituent complaints, took her place at the podium. "We're here tonight," she began, her voice carrying authority earned from 3 terms in office, "to address serious concerns about development practices in our community." She gestured to the stack of documents before her. "The evidence presented to my office suggests a pattern of systematic abuse of HOA authority for private gain." Maxwell's lawyer tried to interject, claiming this was a private HOA matter, but the mayor shut him down. When environmental laws are violated and entire communities are threatened, it becomes a public concern. Dr. Sarah Mitchell presented first. Her environmental impact study now expanded to include 3 neighboring communities. The images on the giant screen behind her told a devastating story. Wildlife corridors destroyed, water tables disrupted, soil stability compromised. This isn't just about a few trees, she explained. It's about the ecological foundation of our entire region. The developers' team shifted uncomfortably as Sarah revealed satellite imagery showing the true scope of their planned development. What they had presented as simple community modernization was actually phase 1 of a massive commercial complex that would destroy acres of established urban forest. Maria Patel followed with architectural renderings showing how the development would transform the area. The gasps from the audience were audible as they saw their tree-lined streets replaced with concrete canyons and artificial landscapes. "They're not modernizing our community," she declared. "They're eliminating it." Robert Foster's engineering presentation hit even harder. His drainage studies showed how removing the mature trees would destabilize the entire hillside. The developers' plans make no provision for soil retention or groundwater management, he explained. They're creating an environmental disaster waiting to happen. Maxwell attempted damage control, approaching the podium with practiced confidence. These changes represent progress, he argued. Property values will increase significantly under our modernization plan. That's when Emily Brooks stood up, her voice clear and strong. "I've lived here 40 years, she said. "I've seen property values rise steadily because of our trees, our natural landscapes, our sense of community. What you're offering isn't progress, it's destruction for profit." The audience erupted in applause. More residents stood to share their stories. Families who had chosen our neighborhood for its natural beauty, retirees who had invested their life savings in homes they now feared losing, young couples who couldn't afford the punitive fines being imposed. Karen Sullivan's testimony about the internal workings of the HOA board drew gasps. She detailed how Maxwell and his predecessors had systematically changed bylaws, ignored environmental regulations, and pressured residents into compliance. Her voice shook, but never wavered, as she exposed years of manipulation and abuse of power. Then came the bombshell. Daniel Wilson, working with state investigators, had uncovered a trail of similar schemes in other cities. Maxwell and his development team had a pattern of using HOA takeovers to force through commercial development projects. The evidence was projected on the giant screen: shell companies, hidden ownership records, pattern of environmental violations. Maxwell's face turned ashen as his past caught up with him. His lawyers huddled in urgent consultation as Daniel continued revealing document after document, showing their true intentions for our community. Frank Thompson laid out the legal implications. These actions violate not just environmental laws, he explained, but state and federal regulations governing property development and HOA management. He turned to face Maxwell directly. The Attorney General's office is very interested in this pattern of behavior. The mayor called for order as the room erupted in angry shouts. Maxwell tried to leave the stage, but security guards stopped him. State investigators were waiting to speak with him about irregularities uncovered in his development permits. Linda Ramirez stood to share statements from other communities that had faced similar threats. The pattern was clear. This wasn't an isolated incident, but a systematic attempt to exploit HOA regulations for corporate profit. As the evidence mounted, the mayor called for an immediate vote on emergency measures to protect threatened communities. The proposal included immediate suspension of all HOA fines related to landscaping, a moratorium on tree removal, and a full investigation into the development plans. The vote was unanimous. Maxwell and his team were escorted from the building by state investigators, their dreams of easy profit crumbling in the face of united community resistance. Outside the convention center, the evening air was sweet with the scent of spring blossoms. Residents gathered in small groups, sharing stories and contact information, forming networks of mutual support. What had started as one neighborhood's fight had grown into a movement. Janet squeezed my hand as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Above us, birds swooped and soared between the trees that lined the street. Trees that would now be protected not just by law, but by the united will of an entire community. Frank Thompson joined us, his briefcase bulging with evidence collected during the hearing. "This isn't over," he warned. "Maxwell and his team will fight the investigations, but they've lost their power over the community. That's what matters most." As we drove home through the gathering dusk, I noticed something remarkable. Porch lights were on all through Maple Ridge Estates, and in front of every house stood small groups of neighbors talking, laughing, sharing the evening together. The trees that Maxwell had seen as obstacles to profit now sheltered a community made stronger by adversity. The cardinal pair greeted us as we pulled into our driveway, their bright feathers catching the last rays of sunlight. Their nest, like our homes, was secure now. But more than that, we had discovered the true value of what we had fought to protect. Not just trees and property values, but the bonds of community that had grown as deep and strong as the roots beneath our feet. Sunlight filtered through fresh spring leaves as volunteers gathered in my backyard for the first annual Maple Ridge Tree Planting Festival. The event had grown far beyond our original vision, with families from across Cedar County joining our community to celebrate and strengthen our urban forest. Emily Brooks supervised the planting locations, her botanical expertise ensuring each new sapling would thrive in its chosen spot. The State Environmental Protection Office had not only upheld our victory, but had gone further, designating our neighborhood as a protected urban wildlife sanctuary. Dr. Sarah Mitchell beamed as she unveiled the official plaques that would mark the boundaries of our newly protected zone. "This designation," she explained to a group of curious children, "means these trees will be here when you grow up, and when your children grow up too." Highland Vista Properties' ambitious development plans lay in ruins. The state attorney General's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption extending far beyond our community. Robert Maxwell faced multiple indictments, and Patricia Weber had fled to Florida, leaving behind a trail of questionable financial dealings that auditors were still unraveling. Jim Martinez worked alongside his teenage sons, teaching them the proper way to plant a young oak tree. "Remember," he said, demonstrating the technique, "you're not just planting a tree, you're creating a legacy." The boys listened intently, understanding now what their father had always known, that stewardship of nature was a responsibility passed down through generations. Karen Sullivan, freed from the constraints of her former position, had emerged as a powerful voice for HOA reform. She worked with state legislators to draft new regulations, preventing the kind of corporate takeover we had faced. The problem wasn't just in our community, she explained to a documentary crew filming the festival. It was a systematic exploitation of HOA regulations that left communities vulnerable. We're changing that. Linda Ramirez's coverage of our struggle had earned her a regional journalism award, but more importantly, it had inspired other communities to examine their own HOA practices. She moved through the festival gathering follow-up stories, documenting how our victory had sparked a movement for community rights and environmental protection across the state. The Wilson couple had transformed their technical expertise into a force for community organization. Their secure communication network, originally created to coordinate our resistance, had evolved into a model for other neighborhoods facing similar threats. "Technology should serve community, not destroy it," Daniel explained as he demonstrated their new neighborhood app to interested visitors. Frank Thompson watched the festivities from my deck, a satisfied smile on his face. The legal precedents established in our case had strengthened environmental protection laws throughout the region. Sometimes, he mused, it takes a threat to make us realize what we stand to lose and what we're capable of protecting. Maria Patel's landscape design firm had been flooded with requests from other communities seeking to enhance and protect their natural spaces. Her vision of harmony between development and nature was reshaping how people thought about urban planning. She stood with a group of city planners, explaining how mature trees could be incorporated into modern design without sacrifice. The festival had drawn unexpected allies. Real estate agents now marketed our neighborhood's protected status as a premium feature, with property values rising steadily since our victory. Developers who once might have followed Highland Vista's model were instead consulting with our community on sustainable development practices. Robert Foster's engineering insights had led to new standards for urban forest management. He worked closely with city planners, helping them understand how mature trees contributed to infrastructure stability. Nature's engineering is often better than ours, he explained to an attentive group of civil engineering students. Our job is to work with it, not against it. Emily Brooks had established a community nursery, growing native species for future planting. She moved through the festival sharing her knowledge, helping families choose the right trees for their yards. Every tree we plant, she said, handling a delicate sapling, is a vote for the future we want to see. The cardinal pair that had become symbols of our resistance now had company. The strengthened wildlife corridor had attracted more birds, and their songs filled the air as people worked. Dr. Mitchell pointed out new nests to excited children, teaching them about the interconnected web of life their community now protected. George Phillips, our elder statesman, sat in a comfortable chair watching the activity with satisfaction. The new HOA board, elected after Maxwell's removal, had asked him to serve as an advisor. His decades of experience now helped guide a more transparent and community-focused organization. Janet organized the refreshment tables, where neighbors shared food and stories. The simple act of gathering had taken on new meaning. Each conversation, each shared meal, strengthened the bonds that had helped us prevail. Children played beneath the mature trees we had fought to protect, their laughter a reminder of why the fight had been worth it. As the day progressed, I found myself standing beneath our largest maple tree, the one that had started it all. Its branches spread wide, offering shade to the gathered community below. A young girl tugged at my sleeve, pointing upward. "Look," she said, "the Cardinal family has babies now." Sure enough, tiny heads peeked over the edge of the nest we had fought so hard to preserve. New life, thriving in the sanctuary we had created. Around me, families planted trees that would grow alongside their children, creating shade for future generations. The festival represented more than just victory over those who would have destroyed our urban forest. It celebrated the power of community, the importance of stewardship, and the understanding that some things, like mature trees and strong neighborhoods, were worth fighting to protect. As evening approached and the last saplings were planted, people gathered for a community photograph. Hundreds of faces, all connected by the simple act of standing together for what they believed in. Above us, the canopy of mature trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering ancient secrets of survival and renewal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to face. But today, watching children water newly planted trees, while their parents chatted with neighbors, I knew we had built something stronger than any development scheme could destroy. We had rediscovered the true meaning of community, rooted in the earth beneath our feet and reaching skyward with every tree we planted. The morning dew sparkled on fresh grass as construction crews dismantled the last remnants of Highland Vista's presence in our neighborhood. Their abandoned development office, once a symbol of corporate overreach, was being transformed into Maple Ridge's first community environmental center. Emily Brooks supervised as workers carefully preserved the mature shrubs around the building, their expertise ensuring no damage to the root systems. Inside the renovated space, Dr. Sarah Mitchell arranged exhibits showcasing our neighborhood's transformation from near environmental disaster to protected urban sanctuary. Display cases highlighted native species, while interactive screens demonstrated the complex relationships between trees, wildlife, and human communities. A wall-sized window overlooked the property where Highland Vista had planned their first commercial structure, now home to a thriving butterfly garden. Janet helped arrange educational materials for school groups, her nursing background lending insight to sections about trees' impact on community health. Studies show hospital recovery rates improve when patients can see trees from their windows. She explained to a visiting teacher, "We're not just protecting nature, we're protecting ourselves." Frank Thompson arrived with a stack of documents, the final legal settlements from our battle. The state's investigation into Highland Vista had revealed corrupt practices across multiple counties, leading to sweeping reforms in HOA regulations. Our case had become a landmark precedent, cited by communities nationwide facing similar threats. Karen Sullivan, now heading the newly formed Community Oversight Committee, reviewed proposed guidelines for sustainable development. The committee, established in the wake of our victory, ensured that future changes would serve the entire community's interests, not just developers' profits. Her office walls displayed framed copies of the environmental protection ordinances our struggle had inspired. Jim Martinez guided a team of landscapers as they implemented Maria Patel's innovative design for water-conscious gardens. The irrigation system, incorporating captured rainwater and natural drainage patterns, demonstrated how development could work with nature rather than against it. Native plants flourished alongside mature trees, creating microhabitats that attracted increasingly diverse wildlife. Linda Ramirez interviewed resident after resident, documenting the transformation for a special feature in the Cedar County Gazette. Her previous coverage had earned national attention, but this story was different. It was about healing, growth, and community renewal. Children played in backgrounds of her photos, their laughter a testament to the neighborhood's restored vitality. Robert Foster's engineering team completed final assessments of soil stability throughout the area. The data confirmed what we had argued all along. Our mature trees played a crucial role in preventing erosion and maintaining ground integrity. His reports would inform future development practices across the state, ensuring other communities could avoid the threats we had faced. The Wilsons upgraded their community communication platform, adding features to track environmental health indicators across the neighborhood. Residents could now monitor everything from air quality to wildlife sightings, creating a comprehensive database of our ecosystem's recovery. The platform had already been adopted by neighboring communities, spreading our model of environmental stewardship. George Phillips presided over the first meeting of the reformed HOA board, his wisdom helping guide the transition to truly representative community governance. The new bylaws, carefully crafted to prevent future abuse, emphasized environmental protection and community input. Each decision now required transparency, consultation, and clear demonstration of community benefit. Emily Brooks established a seed library in the Environmental Center, preserving genetic diversity of local plant species. Her expertise ensured that future generations would have access to the same natural heritage we had fought to protect. Young families visited regularly, learning about native plants and sustainable gardening practices. Dr. Mitchell's ongoing research revealed increasing biodiversity in our protected areas. Species not seen in decades returned to the strengthened wildlife corridor, their presence validating our fight to preserve urban green spaces. Graduate students conducted field studies in our neighborhood, contributing to a growing body of research on urban ecosystem management. Maria Patel collaborated with city planners, incorporating lessons from our experience into municipal development guidelines. Her designs proved that urban growth didn't require environmental destruction. In fact, protecting mature trees enhanced property values and community well-being. Developers who once might have followed Highland Vista's model now sought her guidance on sustainable practices. The Cardinal family thrived in their maple tree home, raising a second brood of chicks as summer approached. Their presence reminded us daily of what we had almost lost and what we had gained through unity and determination. Other birds joined them, creating a symphony of song that filled our mornings with natural music. Karen Sullivan's documentation of Highland Vista's methods became required reading for HOA board members statewide. Her insights helped other communities identify and prevent corporate attempts to exploit residential neighborhoods. The guidelines she developed for transparent HOA management set new standards for community governance. Robert Foster's drainage solutions, working in harmony with existing root systems, solved flooding issues that had plagued certain areas for years. His success demonstrated how engineering could enhance rather than replace natural systems, leading to more sustainable infrastructure practices throughout the region. The Environmental Center hosted its first workshop series, teaching residents about tree care, native gardening, and wildlife protection. Emily Brooks developed curricula for different age groups, ensuring that environmental awareness would be passed down through generations. Children learned to identify local species, understand ecological relationships, and appreciate their role as environmental stewards. Frank Thompson established a legal defense fund for communities facing environmental threats, ensuring that financial constraints wouldn't prevent others from protecting their natural heritage. The fund, supported by recovered damages from our case, provided resources and expertise to neighborhoods fighting similar battles. As summer bloomed in full force, our transformed community attracted visitors from across the country. Environmental groups studied our success, while urban planners examined how our experience could inform future development practices. Each visitor left with a deeper understanding of how communities could protect their natural spaces while fostering healthy growth. Janet organized wellness walks through our preserved green spaces, combining her healthcare knowledge with our environmental victory. Residents who joined learned about the physical and mental health benefits of living among mature trees, strengthening their commitment to environmental protection. The setting sun painted golden light through leaves that had almost been lost to corporate greed. Children played beneath ancient branches, their parents gathering nearby to share stories and plan future improvements. Our neighborhood had become more than just a collection of houses. It was a living testament to the power of community action and environmental stewardship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but our community stood ready to face them together. The trees that had sparked our struggle now stood as silent guardians, their presence a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, and that victory meant not just winning, but transforming the very nature of the fight. 5 years passed like leaves turning in the wind. The saplings planted during our first community festival now stretched skyward, their young branches reaching toward their mature neighbors. Standing on my deck on a crisp autumn morning, watching golden light filter through the canopy that we had fought so hard to preserve, I reflected on how our victory had sparked transformations we never could have imagined. The Cedar County Environmental Leadership Summit had chosen our community center as its permanent home, bringing environmental advocates from across the country to learn from our experience. Emily Brooks, now directing the center's research department, developed pioneering programs that bridged the gap between urban development and environmental preservation. Her work earned national recognition, but she remained most proud of the local children who could name every tree species in their neighborhood. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's research expanded beyond our initial wildlife corridor, documenting how protected urban forests could create sustainable ecosystems within city limits. Her findings influenced urban planning policies nationwide, while her graduate students conducted long-term studies of our thriving bird populations. The cardinal family that had symbolized our struggle now represented dozens of generations, their descendants filling our trees with song. The Wilson's community platform evolved into a sophisticated environmental monitoring system, adopted by cities worldwide. Daniel and Sophie's innovation earned them recognition from global environmental organizations, but they remained rooted in our neighborhood, continuously enhancing the technology to serve community needs. Their young daughter grew up knowing the importance of both technological progress and environmental stewardship. Maria Patel's integrated design approach revolutionized urban development practices. Developers who once saw trees as obstacles now sought her expertise in creating communities that enhance natural spaces. Her signature project, a sustainable housing development that preserved every mature tree on site, won international awards and set new standards for ecological design. Frank Thompson's legal precedents rippled through courtrooms across the country, strengthening environmental protections for countless communities. The defense fund he established helped neighborhoods fight off dozens of attempts at corporate exploitation, while his expertise guided the creation of stronger environmental protection laws. He never forgot that it all started with a simple fight to save some trees. Janet's wellness program expanded into a comprehensive community health initiative, documenting the measurable benefits of living among mature trees. Hospitals consulted her research when designing healing gardens, while insurance companies began offering incentives for communities that maintained significant urban forests. Her work proved what we had instinctively known, that human health and environmental health were inseparable. Karen Sullivan's reforms transformed HOA governance nationwide. Her guidelines for transparent, community-focused management became standard practice, while her advocacy helped pass state laws preventing corporate exploitation of residential neighborhoods. The position she once held in fear now represented a model of ethical community leadership. Jim Martinez's landscaping innovations showed how traditional gardening wisdom could enhance modern environmental protection. His methods for integrating native plants with mature trees created vibrant ecosystems that required minimal maintenance while maximizing environmental benefits. Young landscapers apprenticed in our neighborhood, learning to work with nature rather than against it. Linda Ramirez's continued coverage of our community's evolution inspired similar transformations across the country. Her documentation of our journey from threatened neighborhood to environmental success story earned her a Pulitzer nomination, but she remained most proud of the local stories, the daily triumphs of a community that had learned to value its natural heritage. Robert Foster's engineering principles, proving how mature trees enhanced infrastructure stability, became required study in civil engineering programs. His data on soil retention, water management, and erosion control demonstrated the literal groundwork that trees provided for urban communities. New development projects nationwide incorporated his findings, preserving mature trees as essential infrastructure components. George Phillips, though retired from active leadership, continued mentoring the next generation of community advocates. His institutional knowledge and wisdom helped navigate new challenges, while his stories of our struggle reminded younger residents what their community had fought to become. His greatest joy came from watching children play beneath trees that might have been lost without our intervention. The Environmental Center hosted international delegations studying our success, while local schools made our community a regular field trip destination. Children learned about ecosystems, civil engagement, and the power of community action. Their questions and insights showed how deeply environmental awareness had become part of our community's identity. Island Vista's abandoned development plans became historical exhibits, teaching tools for future generations about the importance of community vigilance and environmental protection. The sites they had marked for destruction now flourished, with native plants and wildlife demonstrating nature's resilience when given the chance to thrive. Patricia Weber's scheme, now a cautionary tale in corporate ethics courses, led to strengthened regulations protecting communities from similar exploitation. The investigation she had fled ultimately resulted in reformed property development laws and enhanced environmental protections. Her failure sparked positive changes that would long outlive her attempted destruction. As autumn painted our trees in brilliant colors, I walked through the neighborhood with my morning coffee. The canopy above created a cathedral of gold and crimson, while fallen leaves cushioned my steps. Children waited for school buses beneath spreading branches, their parents chatting nearby. Joggers and dog walkers greeted each other on tree-lined paths, while birds called from protected perches overhead. Our struggle had grown beyond saving individual trees. We had created a model for community action, environmental protection, and sustainable urban living. The trees that faced destruction now stood as living monuments to what communities could achieve when they united for a common cause. The cardinal pair's descendants still visited our maple tree, their bright feathers flashing like memories of past battles. But now they shared the branches with countless other species, each finding sanctuary in our preserved urban forest. Our neighborhood had become a testament to the possibility of harmony between human development and natural preservation. As new challenges arose, climate change, urban growth, evolving community needs, our experience provided a foundation for addressing them. We had learned that environmental protection strengthened communities, that sustainable development enhanced property values, and that united action could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The sun rose higher, warming the autumn air and carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Another day began in our transformed community, where every tree told a story of resistance, renewal, and hope. Our victory had grown roots as deep as the trees we had saved, nurturing future generations who would continue our legacy of environmental stewardship and community solidarity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.